Today is launch day for the RTX 5070 Ti, and I'm going to definitely be doing two different conclusions for this graphics card here today. And that's because I've been hearing a lot about launch prices being higher than what the MSRP is supposed to come at. And here we've got an MSRP suggested from Nvidia as coming in from $750. But then we saw a lot of different retailers already advertising much higher prices. For instance, Micro Center and Best Buy were pre-listing these cards at around $900 USD. And this was for the majority of the cards. And then some of them even went as high as $1,000 US. But thankfully, the model that we have here is confirmed to be a $750 MSRP model. This is the Ventus 3XOC. Now, again, whether that comes in at MSRP, we'll be talking about that later. Let's get on with some gaming benchmarks here. We're going to be comparing it against the RTX 4080 Super, where I feel like this is exactly where the card is falling in terms of its performance. Now, starting off the rasterization benchmarks here with Age The Veilguard. Here we've got the 1440p and 4K numbers. I'm going to be mainly comparing this to the RTX 4080 Super because as we can see with these graphs, it's coming right around that performance level, even though in this particular title, it slightly loses at 1440p, and then it has a slightly bigger loss at 4K if we were to compare that to the 1440p numbers. Then moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, we have at 1440p basically identical results, then stepping it up to 4K. I think there's a 1 average FPS gap here. So again, basically identical performance. But then moving on to Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, here is where we have, again, identical performance at 1440p. And then at 4K, we slightly pull ahead just like Cyberpunk by 1 average FPS. Though keep in mind, this is where I'm going to interlude here and say you can overclock the 5070 Ti with great success. Here is where we're able to get in this same benchmark at this same spot an overclock of around 450 megahertz on the dial, as well as upping the memory about 500 megahertz. And it can even go to 1000 megahertz, just there's no real benefit after 500 megahertz, at least from the testing here, and it's stepping things up to 76 average FPS, and also the 0.1% lows to gain a big performance advantage here. So if you were getting a 4070 Ti, you would either want to overclock it or undervolt it. And we'll talk about the undervolting numbers later, especially if you are like me and you love putting this thing in a mini RTX solution. Then moving on to Blackmyth Wukong, here's where with 1440p high settings, the 4080 Super has a slight victory over the 5070 Ti, and then at 4K, they basically have identical performance. So it looks like that GDDR7 memory is helping the game push out better 4K numbers in comparison to the 1440p numbers. Though just when you would think that, here's where Final Fantasy 16 shows the opposite. Where the 1440p numbers, we can see that the 5070 Ti Ventus is actually doing better than the 4080 Super, especially compared to the 4K numbers, where it does do better, but it's doing better at 1440p. So it looks like with that GDDR7, it does depend on the game and how it wants to utilize that memory speed. But I'd say the biggest reason for the 5070 Ti to perform close to the 4080 Super would be because of those memory speed gains, especially on its default clock speeds. So the next title we have here is RiftBreaker, and here's where with turning on ray tracing, we still get really good FPS, especially at 1440p. And so I decided to turn on ray tracing for this benchmark because the AMD card also does really well with ray tracing on. And at 1440p, we got better than expected results here, especially over that of the 4080 Super. And then at 4K, it was also pulling ahead by a considerable margin. And the funny thing is with RiftBreakers, when you turn off the ray tracing, you actually don't really gain that much average FPS. So it's kind of worth it to have it on in this particular title. And the next title we're going to pull up here is Fortnite, where I believe this game also has some core ray tracing baked in. And so here's where it does perform actually quite a bit better at 1440p and also 4K than the RTX 4080 Super. So if you're into Fortnite and you like having all the fancy effects turned on and you want to enjoy the game, not just play it competitively, then I guess the new 5000 series, in particular the 5070 Ti, is going to be a great pick for that. But keep in mind, that's providing you're actually able to get one of these graphics cards. I mean, in Australia, I got my 5080 day one. I ordered it day one, and it's still waiting to come in the mail. This is basically 3 weeks later. So the last game we're going to look at for the raw gaming FPS numbers is Marvel Rivals. And here's where we see a real interesting twist, where at 1440p, it comes very close to that of the RTX 5080, and then at 4K, it also does the same thing. Even though it beats out the 4080 Super, it actually beats it out more comfortably at 4K. So it looks like that GDDR7 is again showing that it can make a bigger difference at certain resolutions, and in this case, it's making a bigger difference at 4K. But before we paint this whole picture about the gaming FPS numbers, let's quickly look at the ray tracing numbers. And here's where for Cyberpunk, for instance, with just 4K ray tracing turned to the ultra settings, it was getting identical average FPS as the 4080 Super. And then we move on to Blackmyth, Wukong, it's the same story. And then for Dragon Age The Veilguard, I think it lost by 1 average FPS to the 4080 Super. So the ray tracing performance is going to be virtually the same thing as a 4080 Super. But let's look at the DLSS 4 now, because that is the new feature that is introduced with RTX 5000 series. And you can turn this on if you wish to and get, I guess, 2 extra generated frames above the already generated frames. So 3 sets of AI generated frames for every 1 frame that is actually reacting to your mouse and keyboard response. And so that alone, for me personally, is where DLSS 4 comes in handy for role-playing games, when I want that extra smoothness and I don't care so much about being competitive and I don't need the lowest latency possible. And so I think for a game like Dragon Age Veilguard, DLSS 4 is going to work really well. The same with Cyberpunk and also Blackmyth Wukong. However, when it comes to Marvel Rivals, I'd prefer to leave DLSS 3 and 4 off altogether because I'd want to play this game competitively with my friends. So I'd rather just lower the settings and get higher FPS that way than take advantage of DLSS 3 or 4 in this particular title. But also the last note on DLSS 4, I do like to have a higher base frame rate after using this on my main computer and playing some of these games. I personally like to have around a 60 base FPS to start off with, and then from there, getting say around 240 FPS, it does make a big difference on 4K 240 Hertz. It can really make things look really good and also play smooth. But again, for RPGs and more styles that aren't competitive, I think that's where it's best suited. But now it's time to talk about power consumption, and here's where the 5070 Ti doesn't offer a whole lot more than the 4080 Super. So you'll see from these benchmarks, or at least this one graph that we've got here, it's not doing that much better. It's getting virtually the same FPS in Warhammer Space Marine 2, but it's not giving us that much better efficiency. So this time around, it's more like some refinements than a raw generational increase in efficiency. And you can definitely see that in this one graph right here. But also on that note of power consumption, if you wish to overclock, like we said before, you can max this thing out to basically 300 watts and then get extra performance because the card is capable of actually overclocking really well. But also when it's really capable of overclocking, then it's definitely going to be capable of undervolting. And here's where I'll pull up some different undervolting settings that I use personally with the RTX 5070 Ti here. We got the 2.7 gigahertz undervolt, and then we've got the 2.5 gigahertz, as well as the 2.3 gigahertz. And all of these different undervolt configurations will work really well depending on where you want to drop the power consumption to, and ultimately drop the temperatures of your GPU to, which I think with the MSI Ventus, which we'll talk about really soon, it is very important for me to undervolt this card because the cooler is basically only 1 kilogram, which you're probably thinking, oh, whoa, 1 kilogram, that's actually pretty big. It's actually not that big for 300 watts. And that's where I think this cooler could use a bit more weight. And so when it comes to this card right here, the benefit is, however, it is a model that can fit in a mini ITX solution. Though the problem here is, in my opinion, this cooler is far from the best implementation I've seen, even for an MSRP model, where tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at, for instance, the Palette Gaming Pro. And that's also got a non-OC MSRP model. The cooler on that thing is 1.5 kilograms. So you've already got an extra 50% of just raw dense cooling slapped on that cooler. And that you'll see in tomorrow's video, that does a better job at cooling down the 5070 Ti as well as doing other things. But here's where we'll pull up the profile for this, the noise and the temperatures. And here's where out of the box, it's going up to around 63% on the default profile. And that's around 2,280 RPM. So it's actually pretty noisy from the get-go. I'll give you guys a quick listen at the 3 different fan speeds that I decided to test with here. where 100% is just honestly unbearable, but I'm used to seeing under 60% on a default profile. So I usually include the default profile that's under 60%, then a 60% manual fan speed and an 80%. But this time around, this thing's going over 60% out of the box. And this is in a 23C ambient environment. So it's not really as hot as I test in Australia because I'm testing in 25C over in Australia. And so the cooler that they've implemented on the MSI Ventus 3X here, I think in terms of performance, it's mediocre. However, that said, when it comes to the aesthetics, this is probably one of the cleanest, if not the cleanest, boxiest MSI Ventus models I've ever seen. To me personally, I like the fact that they've gone with a satin finish for most of the design on the card here on the paint, and then the simple boxy nature of the card does make it actually stand out. Also quickly, you guys asked me to test the memory junction temperatures, and here's where they went up to 78 degrees in Dragon Age Veilguard. This was one of the games that pulled the highest amount of VRAM usage, so I tested the memory junction temperatures, and they were fine. They were staying under 80 degrees, and so there's nothing to worry about in terms of high memory temperatures on the Ventus 3X OC. And with all that out of the way, it is time for a conclusion where I'll also talk about productivity a little bit, because there will be some of those people out there that want to see some productivity numbers. Unfortunately, I had to leave to Japan in a hurry, and I forgot to bring my 4K rendering test with me to get accurate results for you guys. But I will say one thing, this 5070 Ti does have one less decoder than the 5080. However, it does have the dual encoders, and they are the new generation solutions. And so if you're looking to get one of these or a 5080 and the 5080 is just unobtainable, or one of the models won't fit a mini RTX build, then the 5070 Ti is going to do a pretty good job, as well as posting out some pretty impressive scores when it came to the OpenCL benchmark, as well as the V-Ray and the ray tracing benchmark within V-Ray itself. So now it's time to talk about the most important thing with any graphics card, and that is the value. With a new generation, you're going to expect better value. And here is where I'm honestly just going to split this review into two different recommendations, and that is the $750 MSRP that NVIDIA has been saying these will come in from. And then there's the $900 that is, in my opinion, it's more likely going to be that $900 price point. When I look at, for instance, the Japanese pricing on the website there, and I convert that to USD, it's coming over 900 USD. And sure, they have a 10% sales tax in Japan, but even when you take that 10% off, it's right around that 900 USD price point. So I'm seeing more realistically a scenario here where it's a 900 USD card on the market, on the streets. And so we'll start off with the 750, and we'll pull up a rasterization value chart as well as a ray tracing value chart for you guys, because this will just explain everything in a nutshell. If it's $750, comparing it against the 4080 Super, where it basically gives out very similar performance, it's going to be a really good buy. Like, you're getting over 30% value for your dollar. But if it's at that $900 price point, then it's really nothing special at all. It's basically, I think, in the range of like around 10% in terms of its value, its proposition here. So it's just nothing special at all. And that's unfortunate, because I'd like to see it at that 30% more value mark and really driving home hard the value, which is what more people need. The more they see these high inflation numbers in the economy, the more grocery prices are going up on the shelves. It's like one thing they could take sort of a bit of happiness in is to say, hey, well, I can get this graphics card and play some games and know that I'm getting good value there, right? And it's like, well, kinda, not that great this time around, son. And so basically, if I saw this thing coming in at 750 USD, I'd actually be very happy and consistent throughout this whole review and talk about how good of a deal you're going to be getting here. Except what we've seen with the 5080 launch and the 5090 launch already is that the majority of these cards have sold for well over that intended MSRP. And so that $900 price point that we've been hearing about, it's probably going to be a more realistic scenario when these cards drop. And so that really just pits it with a really minimal value uplift over the previous generation cards, which I didn't expect to come into the 5000 series launch being excited and then coming out of it being kind of depressed. And actually making this video right now for you guys, I'm just going to go like off the regular tangent of a GPU review and just talk to you guys about how just disappointing it is that there's so many people that want these cards at MSRP and they get promised that at the launch and they can't get that. They just can't get it. They can't get access to them. And then you read up that there's been less stock this time around than the 4000 series launch. Honestly, it just comes back to the point of just hold the launch off until there's a lot more stock and be just transparent about the prices. What are people going to expect to pay at the shelves? Instead of getting guys behind a chair like us, hitting record on our cameras and telling you guys, hey, it's going to be $750. And when it's realistically, it ain't going to be $750, right? That's what we're looking at. This card ain't going to be $750. That's what we're seeing. That's what the numbers show us with the 5080 and the 5090. And this is what is looking more realistic with the 5070 Ti. So this time around, I just feel like it's going to be that $900 price point, which is really just going to make it a 10% uplift in value plus DLSS 4. And so it's just nothing great for a generational increase. It's really nothing great at all, especially with the 5070 Ti, where you don't even get an extra decoder or something like that versus the 4080 Super. So if that's the realistic scenario, then it's not that great at all. In fact, it's one of the worst GPU launches ever. But if it is the 750, and I do get surprised and there's a lot of 5070 Ti stock out on the shelves, or if you come back to this video in a few months and you can actually get a 5070 Ti for around 750 USD, then it's going to be pretty good. So it's just this time around, I'm already seeing the telltale signs that it is not going to be 750, at least for the next couple of months at the very least. And so that, guys, is it for the RTX 5070 Ti Ventus 3X OC. I hope you enjoyed today's review. If you did, be sure to hit that like button for us. Let us know in the comment section below what you think about these cards and what you think about this model in particular. Are you looking forward to getting one at MSRP or getting one at 900 USD? Would love reading your thoughts and opinions about all that stuff. And with that aside, I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. It'll actually be the Palette Gaming Pro. And so that model is actually going to be really desirable for people who want less noise as well as more performance. Anyhow, see you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.